5.1, example 6. So in this example, we're going to look at combining fractions. So this makes it easier to evaluate trig functions that are complicated at certain values if we can make them simpler by reducing them. So the first thing I'm going to do with this problem is actually rewrite it down right below so I can work with it. The technique for getting rid of fractions is very similar to as if you have numbers. You want to have common denominators. So notice the denominator here is 1 minus sine of x, and the denominator here is cosine of x. So my fraction on my left is going to need cosine of x over cosine of x, and my fraction on my right is going to need 1 minus sine of x over 1 minus sine of x. So now I just have to go through the process of very carefully multiplying everything. We have a cosine here and a cosine here. So cosine times cosine is cosine squared. So I'm going to get sine of x times cosine squared of x minus. And I'm going to write parentheses 1 plus sine of x times 1 minus sine of x. And I'll worry about distributing that all later. And this whole thing is divided by cosine of x times 1 minus sine of x. And I can write them as one fraction because the denominators are the same. So what I want to do now is kind of on the side, just work out the numerator. So I'm going to take this whole piece and I'm going to work this out over here. I do that because I don't want to have to write the denominator every single time because it's not going to change. I'm just going to leave it as it is, and I don't want to rewrite it a bunch of times. So my numerator was sine of x times cosine squared minus 1 plus sine of x times 1 minus sine of x. Okay, so I need to distribute this all out. So I'm going to do that over here. So 1 times 1 is 1. 1 times a negative sign is negative sine of x. Sine times 1 is positive sine of x. And sine times sine is negative sine squared of x. So these are going to cancel off. And I'm left with 1 minus sine squared. So this is going to take its place right here. So I get sine of x cosine squared of x minus 1 minus sine squared. Now what I might want to do is go ahead and distribute this negative. However, that's going to create more work for me. Because when I look at this, I should think Pythagorean triple. Well, we know that 1 minus sine squared is cosine squared. So this just becomes sine of x cosine squared of x minus, and this piece on the inside is going to become cosine squared of x. So now I get sine of x cosine squared of x minus cosine squared. And then what I can do is I can actually factor out a cosine squared. So I get cosine squared sine of x minus 1. And that's probably about as simple as we can make the numerator. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that back in my original problem. So all of this is taking place of that numerator. So it becomes cosine squared sine of x minus 1. All divided by cosine of x 1 minus sine of x. Now this is already looking much, much better. We can reduce this by canceling one of these. So that's going to give me cosine of x sine of x minus 1 all over 1 minus sine of x. And I know your gut instinct is to go like this and cancel these two. However, you can't because this is sine of x minus 1 and this is 1 minus sine of x. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and factor a negative out of the numerator, so cosine of x, and then on the inside it's now going to become 1 minus sine of x, because the sine of x becomes negative and the negative 1 becomes positive, all divided by 1 minus sine of x. Now I can reduce these off, and I'm left with my final answer of negative cosine of x. So in part B, we're going to do something very, very similar. We're going to end up combining common denominators. So the first thing I like to do is go ahead and rewrite it. Now, the left term is going to need a cosine of x. So I multiply by cosine of x over cosine of x. My right term is going to go ahead and need that 1 plus sine of x. And then I very carefully will multiply everything. So cosine times cosine is cosine squared. And then it's going to be over cosine of x, 1 plus sine of x, plus, and I'll worry about multiplying these in just a minute, 1 plus sine of x, all over cosine of x, 1 plus sine of x. Now notice that my denominators are exactly the same, so I'm going to go ahead now and write this as one fraction. So I get cosine squared plus, and then I'm going to multiply these. So I get 1 plus 2 sine of x plus sine squared of x, all divided by cosine of x times 1 plus sine of x. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and take this numerator, and I'm going to work it out on the side. So I'm going to work it out like over here. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is start cleaning this up. Well, I look right here, and I have a cosine squared and a sine squared. So I know that if I do cosine squared plus sine squared, I'm going to get a 1. So I'm going to take a step just to kind of rewrite the order of this problem. Plus 1 plus 2 sine of x. Because right here, now I have my identity. Cosine squared plus sine squared is equal to 1. So plus 1 plus 2 sine of x. So I'm going to get 2 plus 2 sine of x. And then I can factor out a 2. And I'm going to get 1 plus sine of x. So I'm using this in order to clean up the numerator, which is going to allow me to simplify my fraction. So I'm going to put that right there, and then I divide it by my denominator, which is cosine of x times 1 plus sine of x. And now this problem actually becomes really nice because these reduce off, and I get 2 divided by cosine of x, which is just 2 secant of x.